Two sons of the great house lay in the dirt, and the one they called useless was still on his feet. Nobody in the courtyard moved. The instructors had stopped counting. The servants along the wall had stopped pretending to work. Alan lay on his back with his sword 3 paces away from his hand. Hartz was on his knees beside him, one arm hanging wrong, his breath coming in short broken pulls. Between them stood the third son, the sick one, the disappointment, the boy his own family had written off before he could hold a blade properly. His shirt was soaked through. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the hilt with both of them. Then he coughed, and blood came up, and he went down onto one knee like a man whose strings had been cut. The family physician reached him first. His father did not move at all. Theodor von Reinhofer stood on the upper walkway with his fingers pressed flat against the rail, staring down at a son he had spoken to perhaps 12 times in the last 3 years, and for the whole length of that silence, he was trying to work out what he had just watched. Because the boy had not simply won. He had lost the first half of that duel on purpose. Theodore had seen it. He had watched his youngest take hit after hit and count something under his breath while he did it. There was a red-haired girl at the edge of the yard who had come to this house expecting to watch a joke. She was not laughing. Here is the part none of them could have guessed. The person inside that ruined body was not Theodore's son. He had never held a sword before that month. He had never ridden a horse, never cast a spell, never bled from anything worse than a needle. He was a young man from another world entirely, and in that world he had been dying in a narrow hospital bed with a machine counting for him. He had died there, or something close enough to it, and he had woken up inside a character he built himself, in a game he had played 27 times, wearing a body that came with the same disease he thought he had left behind. That was the joke nobody in the courtyard understood. He had escaped one death sentence by walking directly into a second one. To explain how a dying gamer ended up bleeding on his own family's training ground, we have to go back to a room with white walls, in a city that no longer exists for him. He was young. That was the part people always found hardest. The doctors used careful words and long pauses, and by the third visit he had learned to translate them. There was no treatment left worth trying. There were months, and then there were fewer months. His parents had stopped coming with hope in their faces. His friends had drifted, the way people do when a conversation stops having anywhere to go. So he played games. Games were the one place where a body did not matter. In a game, his hands never shook, and his lungs never failed him halfway up a staircase, and death was a number that reset. His favorite was called Inner Lunatic. It was a brutal fantasy RPG with a reputation for eating new players alive, and he had beaten it, broken it, and mapped it. 27 full runs. He knew which chests were traps. He knew which side quests handed out garbage, and which one hid an item worth 100 hours. He knew that the merchant in the Eastern District lied about his prices, and that the third-year swordsmanship instructor at the academy could be provoked into a demonstration that taught you a skill for free. He also knew the story. He knew who died, and roughly when, and which smiling faces turned out to be holding knives. On his last night in that hospital bed, he started a new character. The game let players build a noble from scratch. Family, appearance, starting traits, the works. He had done it dozens of times. This run he was not chasing an optimal build, because he had stopped believing he would live long enough to finish it. He was just playing. He gave the character black hair and a face he liked. He picked a dark, noble house with a reputation for swordsmanship and cursed magic. And when the trait screen opened, he did something the game clearly did not want him to do. He took multiple genius traits at once. Genius traits were the top tier. Most builds took one and spent the rest of the budget on stats. He took 2 of the best in the game, one for combat instinct and one for reading the flow of mana, and the system charged him for the greed. It applied a penalty. It began stacking negatives onto his sheet to balance the ledger, and one of those negatives came from somewhere it should never have been able to reach. The screen listed a condition: a wasting illness, reduced stamina, reduced growth, a shortened lifespan. His own diagnosis, spelled out in a fantasy character sheet, in the calm, neutral font of a game menu. He remembered laughing at that, alone, at 3 in the morning, because it was either laugh or start screaming. Then he named the character Nox, and clicked to begin, and the room went white, and he never saw that world again. Nox opened his eyes on a bed with silk sheets and a canopy above it. in a room bigger than the entire floor of the hospital ward, and the date on the desk calendar read the 4th of February, 1812. He tried to sit up and nearly blacked out from the effort. That was his introduction to the body. Not the wealth, not the impossible fact of being in a place that should not exist, but the pain. Rolling onto his side took him a full minute. Standing took 2 attempts. His legs held, barely. His chest burned as if he had sprinted a mile. Something in the corner of his vision flickered, and a panel resolved out of nothing. It was the game's status window, the same one he had stared at for years, and it was floating in a room where such a thing had no business being. The stats on it were the worst he had ever seen attached to a living character. His stamina was a joke, his strength barely registered, and near the bottom sat the trait he had accepted for the sake of a build he never intended to finish, sitting there now like a tumor. Underneath it was a number, his remaining lifespan, roughly 1 year. He read it 4 times. He was still reading it when the panel changed on its own. The window addressed him. Not Knox. It used the name he had been born with in the other world, the one no character in this world could possibly know. It told him it had been a while. It said he had done well over the past 2 years, which meant nothing to him, because he could not remember 2 years of anything relevant. It said the place he came from had never been what he believed it was. It instructed him to enter the academy and follow the main story, and it suggested that if he did, he might recover what he had lost. Then it closed, and it would not open again no matter what he did. He sat on the edge of a stranger's bed with his heart going far too fast for a man who had only walked 6 steps, and he tried to think like a player instead of a patient. Fact 1. He was inside inner lunatic, in the body of Knox von Reinhardt, 3rd son of a dark noble house. Fact 2. He knew this character. He had not just built him, he had met him in previous playthroughs, on the other side of the story, as an obstacle. Knox was a minor villain, arrogant, cruel to servants, useless with a blade, resented for being the one Reinhardt in 3 generations born without a scrap of talent. The character existed to be a stain on his family and then to die badly somewhere in the middle chapters, and nobody who played the game ever mourned him. Fact 3. The illness was real, and it had followed him across, and it was going to kill this body in about a year unless he found a way to stop it. Fact 4, and this was the only good one. He knew this world better than anyone alive in it. Every dungeon, every hidden reward, every character who would matter, and every character who would betray. He had a map of the future in his head, and everyone around him was walking blind. He decided 2 things before he left that room. He was not going to die on schedule, and until he understood what the system wanted from him, he was going to keep playing the part of the man everyone expected, because a villain nobody respects is a villain nobody watches closely. The first person he had to convince was a girl who was already terrified of him. Her name was Lona, and she was his personal maid, which in practice meant she was the servant who had drawn the shortest straw in the household. She came in with a tray, saw him standing, and went so pale he thought she might drop it. When he asked her a normal question in a normal voice, she flinched as if he had raised a hand. He learned quickly what the previous Knox had been like. Lona had a habit of setting things down and immediately stepping back out of arm's reach. She did it without noticing she was doing it. Somebody had taught her that. He kept the cold face on, he needed the reputation, but he stopped throwing things and he stopped snapping, and when she brought him breakfast he ate it instead of complaining about it, and the confusion on her face was almost comic. She could not work out whether he was planning something. She kept glancing at him sideways the way you check on a dog that has stopped barking. It took her 4 days to stop shaking around him. It took 2 weeks before she made her first joke in his presence, an accident, half swallowed, and then covered her mouth in horror. He pretended not to hear it. She stood there red to the ears for a full minute. She was the first person in either of his lives who worried about him without being paid extra to do it, and he told himself that was useful. He told himself a lot of things in those weeks. Meanwhile, he started training, and it went badly. His body could not take running. It could not take 100 practice swings. 10 minutes of light work and he was on his knees in the dirt behind the storehouse, coughing until his vision spotted. On the 3rd day, he passed out entirely and woke up with Lona crying over him, convinced she had killed her master by failing to stop him. That was when he stopped trying to solve the problem with effort and started solving it the way a player would. The illness was a trait. Traits interacted with items. Growth was a modifier, and modifiers could be stacked. Inner Lunatic had a deep and slightly broken alchemy layer that most players ignored because the returns were low, but the returns were only low if you were healthy. For a body with his sheet, the numbers looked very different. He knew a monster core with the right properties could be dissolved and taken in small doses. He knew a particular weed that grew in the northern gardens was classified as a mild poison, and he knew that a mild poison forced the body's recovery to work harder, and he knew exactly how much of it a person could take before mild became lethal. He was not guessing. He had watched dozens of streamers kill themselves testing that curve. He had killed himself testing it. He sent Lona out for ingredients with a list and an expression that dared her to ask questions, and she came back with everything, and then she watched her master drink something that made him vomit for an hour, and she started crying again. He told her flatly that she was not to interfere and not to report it. She agreed. She also started leaving a basin and a clean cloth in his room every night, without being asked, and never mentioned it once. Within 11 days, his growth rate had climbed off the floor. Within 3 weeks, a full training session no longer put him on the ground. He was still weaker than an ordinary boy his age, but the curve had bent, and he was the only person in the house who could see it. Then his father made an announcement that turned the whole thing into a race. The Reinhofer family held a limited number of places at Eladan Academy. It was not a school in the ordinary sense. It was where the Empire's best were built, where noble houses proved they still mattered, and in the game it was where the main story lived. Every important character passed through it. Every major event in the first half of the story started inside its walls. The system had told him to enter the academy. He needed the academy for reasons the system had not bothered to explain, and there was exactly one place left. His twin brothers had already divided it between them in their heads. Alan and Hearts were 17, gifted, loud about it, and they had spent their entire lives standing on their little brother as a convenient step. Hearts was the crueler of the two. He had a habit of asking Nox questions in front of guests, sweet questions with hooks in them, and waiting for the room to laugh. Nox listened to them argue about which of them deserved the slot. Then he told his father he was taking it. The dining hall went silent. Alan actually laughed out loud. Hearts asked whether the family should send a physician along with him, since he might need one for the walk to the gate, and this time the servants did not laugh, because the servants had learned to be careful around Nox lately and could not explain why. Theodore looked at his youngest son for a long moment. Then he set the terms. A duel in the family yard in 20 days. Whoever won took the place. He said it the way a man says something to end a conversation, and Nox understood perfectly that his father expected the humiliation to be educational. 20 days. He ran the numbers that night with a pen and a sheet of household paper, and he came out with a threshold. He did not need to beat his brothers as he was. He needed his stats to cross a specific line, and he needed the fight to last long enough for one particular thing to become usable. Because he had not told anyone about the genius traits. 9 days before the duel, the girl who was supposed to kill him walked into the house. Her name was Talia von Stellener. Red hair, a fire affinity strong enough to be discussed by adults in other provinces, and a family alliance to discuss with Theodore. She was 15 and already famous, and she had the specific impatience of someone who had never in her life been the least talented person in a room. Nox saw her cross the entrance hall and had to stop walking. He knew her face. He knew it from a scene in the game's later chapters, from a version of this story where a young man named Nox von Reinhofer went too far, and a fire mage with that exact hair burned him out of the plot. She had been an obstacle in his runs, a good one actually. He had liked her. Now she was standing in his house, in a green travel coat, complaining about the roads. She noticed him staring. Her eyes went from his face down to his frame and back up, and whatever she found there did not impress her. She had heard about the Reinhofer third son. Everyone had. When Emma, her attendant, quietly reminded her that this was still the son of a great house, Talia answered with something politely dismissive about how great houses sometimes produce ornaments, and she said it just loudly enough to carry. He did not react. He gave her the flat villain stare he had been practicing, held it a beat too long to be comfortable, and walked past her. Behind him, Emma whispered that the boy was unsettling. Talia said he was pathetic. Both of those things were about to become very embarrassing for her. He trained through those last 9 days like a man working against a clock, which he was, twice over. He drank things that would have hospitalized an ordinary noble. He slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of it swinging a practice blade in the dark behind the storehouse, where the household guard would not see his form and report it upward. Because his form was the tell. That was what he could not let anyone watch. A person who has never trained does not move well. A person carrying genius-tier combat instinct moves like the answer to a question nobody asked. Even at terrible stats, even weak, even sick, the way his feet found position was wrong for a boy with his reputation. He noticed the head groundskeeper watching him one evening from 30 paces away with a very strange expression, and he fell over on purpose, and the man went back to raking. The morning of the duel, Lona helped him with his coat and could not stop her hands from trembling. He told her the odds were fine. She said nothing, which for her was practically an argument. The yard was full. Half the household had found a reason to be there. Theodore watched from the walkway with Grin beside him, the eldest brother, the polished one, the one Knox privately considered the most dangerous person in the family. Talia stood near the wall with Emma, not because she cared, she made sure to say, but because she had never seen a Reinhardt duel. Alan came out first, spinning his sword, playing to the crowd. The first 90 seconds were ugly. Knox took a cut across the forearm and a boot to the ribs, and he went down twice, and Alan started narrating the fight for the audience because he could afford to. Talia turned to leave. Emma had to remind her that walking out mid-duel would be rude. What none of them could see was the panel in the corner of Knox's vision, and the number climbing on it, and how close that number was getting to the line he had worked out on household paper 19 days earlier. He was not surviving, he was waiting. On the third knockdown he stayed low a fraction longer than he needed to, and he crossed the threshold, and he activated the ability he had been holding since the day he woke up in this world. Genius hour. 5 minutes, no more, in which his body performed at the level his instincts were actually rated for. The change was not dramatic to look at. He simply stood up, and then he was inside Alan's guard, and Alan's sword was in the dirt, and Alan was sitting down hard with an expression of total confusion on his face. Nobody clapped. Nobody knew what they had just seen. Knox turned to the walkway, still breathing like a man drowning, and asked his father for permission to fight both of them at once. Hartz came into the yard shouting. He was faster than his twin and a great deal angrier, and he opened by trying to end it in a single exchange, and that was the mistake. Knox let the blade come. He moved half a step, redirected it, and put Hartz on the ground with an arm that would be in a sling for 6 weeks. Alan came back up. Knox took him apart in 4 movements without saying a word to him, and afterward the household guard captain would swear he had never seen a first-year technique executed cleaner, and he would be told firmly to stop repeating that. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. That was how long the whole thing took. Then the ability ran out, and every debt the body had been ignoring came due at once, and Knox went down onto one knee in the dirt, and that brings us back to the yard where this story started. The physician got to him. Lona got there faster, and to the horror of everyone present, a maid put her arms around her master in front of the entire household and refused to move. Talia von Stelliner did not go back inside with the rest of them. She stayed in the yard, staring at the blood on the ground, doing arithmetic she did not like. She had watched him take those hits. She had assumed cowardice, because that was what she had been told to assume. Now she understood that she had watched a boy with a broken body deliberately absorb damage while he waited for something, and that meant every rumor about the useless Reinhardt son had been built on a lie, or on something worse than a lie, on a truth nobody had bothered to look at closely. She found him that evening in a corridor, and she apologized, badly. She was clearly not practiced at it. She said she had judged him by what she had heard, and that she had been wrong, and then she stood there waiting for him to be gracious about it. He told her she had been right, actually, and kept walking. Emma thought he was insufferable. Talia did not sleep much that night. Theodore did not sleep either. He sat in his study with a report from the guard captain and a report from the physician and a very old suspicion forming. His son had changed in less than 2 months. Not improved, changed. His posture, his vocabulary, the way he looked at people, the way he no longer flinched at the family name. There were 3 explanations Theodore could think of, and 2 of them ended with a corpse in his house wearing his son's face. He did not confront the boy. He started watching him instead, which was considerably worse. And in his room, alone, Knox opened the reward panel that had appeared after the duel and found free stat points waiting. Every instinct he had built over 27 playthroughs said to dump them into stamina. Stamina was survival. Stamina was the thing killing him. He put all of them into luck. Because stamina could be trained, slowly, painfully, and luck could not. Luck touched drop rates, reward tiers, encounter tables, and the quality of every scroll this world would ever hand him. A man with 1 year to live could not afford to earn things at the normal speed. He needed the world to start giving him better ones. The system registered the change. Then it offered him a skill scroll for his victory, and the color of it stopped his breath. Scrolls in Inner Lunatic came in ordinary, silver, gold, and above those, something most players saw twice in a lifetime. He had gambled his entire reward on a stat that most builds treated as decorative, and the game had answered immediately. The scroll was gold. He opened it alone, with the door barred and the curtains drawn, because a Reinhardt using an unknown skill was a rumor he could not afford yet. The scroll gave him a debuff. Not a weapon, not a burst of power, nothing that would look impressive in a duel. It was a passive pressure that weighed on anything standing in front of him with lower numbers than his own, dragging at their speed, their reactions, their nerve. Against an equal, it would do almost nothing. Against something beneath him, it turned a hard fight into a short one. For most players, that was a disappointing pull. They wanted damage. Nox sat on the floor and laughed until it hurt, because he did not need damage. He needed fights to end fast. Every second a battle continued was a second his lungs were spending money he did not have. A skill that shortened fights was, for him specifically, a life extension item wearing a combat skill's clothes. He was still working out how to hide it when the panel showed him something he had not asked to see. It was a cost notice, attached to Genius Hour, and it had been generated by his use of it in the duel. The ability drew from the thing his body had least of. Every activation shaved time off the number at the bottom of his sheet, and the shaving was not temporary. It did not grow back with rest. He checked his lifespan. The figure had moved. Not much. Enough. 3 minutes and 40 seconds in the yard, and it had cost him weeks. He sat with that for a long time. In the game, Genius Hour had been a fantastic ability with a cooldown and no real drawback, because in the game his character had not been dying. The drawback existed. He had simply never been the kind of player it could reach. So the strongest tool he owned was also a knife he was holding by the blade. He could win almost any fight he could survive long enough to trigger it, and every time he did, he moved the ending closer. He wrote out a rule for himself that night and did not break it for a long time afterward. Genius Hour was for survival, not for winning. If there was any other way, he took the other way, even if the other way was slower and humiliating and left him bleeding. Then he went looking for the things that could add to the number instead of taking from it. His father summoned him a week later, and Nox went in expecting an interrogation about possession. He got a horse instead. It was tradition. A Reinhardt who earned an academy place chose a mount from the family stables, and the family stables were famous. Theodore walked him along the stalls himself, which was in itself an event, because Theodore did not walk anywhere with his youngest son. The stablemaster showed off the best of them, a chestnut warhorse with a bloodline 3 generations deep, an elegant gray that had cost more than most manors. Nox walked past all of them to the far end of the row, where a dark gray horse stood alone in a stall nobody had cleaned recently. The stablemaster said the animal was not an option. When pressed, he explained. The horse had a wasting condition that had already taken 2 of its stablemates. It had 2 days left, perhaps 3. He had been waiting for permission to have it put down. Nox said he wanted that one. Theodore's expression did something complicated. Grin, standing behind him, made a small noise that was almost a laugh, and then thought better of it. The stablemaster tried 3 times to talk him out of it, and then looked to Theodore, who after a long pause simply nodded, because he had decided he was going to let his son show him what he was. The name on the stall board was Carl. Here is what nobody in that stable knew. In Inner Lunatic, there was a hidden line in the mount system, so obscure that the community had argued about whether it was even real. A specific dark gray bloodline, when it survived past a certain stage of the wasting sickness, converted. It became something the game did not have another word for. The condition was not a disease in that bloodline. It was a change that almost none of them lived through. Nox had never once seen it happen in 27 runs. He had read the data, He had read 3 separate arguments about whether the data lied. He was betting a horse's life on a forum theory, and he knew it. Lona was assigned to help him with the animal, and she took to it with an enthusiasm that surprised him. She talked to it. She smuggled it apples from the kitchen and blamed the shortage on rats. Carl, for his part, was a miserable and unfriendly animal who bit her twice in the first 3 days and then started waiting at the stall door for her, which she took as a personal victory and announced to the entire household. On the 5th day, Carl went down and did not get up. Knox was there. He had been there for most of 2 days, sitting on an upturned bucket with his back against the stall wall, watching the numbers on a panel nobody else could see. The horse's breathing went shallow, and then ragged, and then stopped, and Lona made a sound he had never heard from her before, and the conversion did not happen. The theory was wrong, or the theory was right and he had missed a condition. Either way, there was a dead horse in the straw and a girl on her knees beside it with her hands in its mane. He sent her away. She did not want to go. He told her to go, in the voice he used for the villain act, and she went, and he heard her crying in the corridor. Then he closed the stable door and did the thing he had been trying not to do. Every player of Inner Lunatic got 1 skill voucher during the early game. It was a free choice from a wide pool, and every guide agreed on the optimal picks. There was a category most players never opened, because the game marked it as restricted, and because the skills inside it belonged to a specific Dark Mage family, who were not his family, and using them was the kind of thing that started inquisitions. The Book of the Undead was in that category. He spent his voucher on it, alone, in a cold stable, over the body of a horse he had owned for 5 days. The ritual was not dramatic. It was long, and it was precise, and it demanded more from him than the duel had. Halfway through, he had to stop and put his forehead against the stall post, because the room was tilting. He kept going. He was aware, distantly, that if anyone opened that door in the next hour he would be dead by nightfall, and his family would help them do it. Carl stood up an hour before dawn. His eyes had gone wrong, a pale, colorless thing that did not reflect lamplight properly, and his coat had darkened almost to black, and when he moved, there was no sound of breathing at all. He was also, by every measure the panel gave, roughly 4 times the animal he had been. Knox leaned against the wall and started laughing, and the laugh turned into a coughing fit, and he ended up sitting in the straw with a resurrected horse standing over him, nudging him with a nose that had no warmth in it. He told Lona in the morning that the horse had recovered. She did not believe him for about 2 seconds. Then she was in the stall with her arms around Carl's neck, sobbing into his mane, and Carl bit her, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. She asked no questions. She never asked a single question about it, not that week, not that year, and Knox eventually understood that she had decided not to know, deliberately, and that this was the most loyal thing anyone had ever done for him. The stablemaster examined Carl 3 times and then quietly stopped mentioning him. Grin mentioned him. Grin mentioned him to Theodore, along with a comment about how strange it was that a horse dying of a wasting illness had made a full recovery in the care of a boy dying of a wasting illness. He said it lightly, the way he said everything, and Theodore filed it away with the guard captain's report, and the physician's report, and the growing pile of things about his youngest son that did not add up. Knox had a horse that no longer needed food, rest, or a heartbeat. What he needed now was the ring. He had known about the cursed forest since his 4th playthrough. It sat on Rheinhafer land, past the northern boundary, marked on every map with a warning, and treated by the household as a place where poachers went to disappear. In the game it was optional content, badly balanced, wildly out of scale for the point in the story where you could first reach it. It had killed him 11 times. He remembered every one of those deaths in the specific, itemized way a player remembers a wall they eventually broke. The pack behavior changed after the first 50 kills. The difficulty scaled off how far in you went, not how long you stayed. The elite that guarded the deep clearing did not appear until enough of its pack had died, and it opened with a lunge that most players read too late because it came from the left. And, in the deep clearing, on the corpse of that elite, was a ring. The ring was junk for a normal character, a small stamina bonus, a small mana bonus, and a passive that siphoned a fraction of a defeated enemy's life force into the wearer. Players ignored the passive because it did nothing useful for a character with a full health bar and no upper limit worth extending. For a man with a number counting down at the bottom of his sheet, It was the only thing in the first act of the game that added to that number instead of subtracting from it. Stronger enemies, more return. That was the line in the item description he had read 100 times without caring. He told no one where he was going. He left before dawn with Carl, a sword, 3 doses of the worst thing in his alchemy chest, and a plan built out of 11 previous failures. He got 2 hours in before he realized someone was following him. Talia had not been subtle about it. She had been following a boy who could detect the flow of mana at a genius rating, and she had been doing it while carrying a fire affinity that lit her up in his perception like a lantern in a cellar. He had known she was there since the second turn of the trail. He had simply been hoping she would get bored. He stopped and told her to go back to the house. She had an entire speech prepared. It involved the words unacceptable, reckless, and, memorably, suicidal. And it made it clear she had spent several days building a theory about him and had come out here to test it. She wanted to know how a boy who could barely climb a staircase had put both his brothers on the ground. She wanted to know what he had been waiting for during those first 90 seconds. She had come to the forest with him because she had decided that whatever he was hiding, he would have to stop hiding it here. Nox told her that people who followed him into this forest tended not to come out of it. She said she would take her chances. Somewhere behind that, though she would not have admitted it to Emma or to herself, was a simpler thing. She had apologized to him, and he had brushed it away, and it had been sitting under her ribs ever since like a splinter. The wolves came out of the tree line 40 minutes later. The first one broke from the left flank and went for her, because she was smaller and closer to the ground, and it made the same calculation any predator makes. Nox was between it and her before he had finished deciding to move, and he opened its throat on the way past, and it was dead before Talia had finished drawing breath to warn him. She stared at the body, then she stared at him. That was the moment her theory collapsed, because there had been no glow, no visible ability, nothing she could point at. He had simply moved correctly, faster than a sick boy should be able to, with a hand that knew exactly where the artery was. There was no time to discuss it. The rest of the pack came through the trees in a wave, and the number on the panel in Nox's vision told him something he did not share with her, which was that the scaling had triggered early because there were 2 of them, and that the count coming toward them was well past 100. She was better than he expected. That was the thing that surprised him most about that hour. In the game, Talia had been a fire mage with a temper and a strong opening burst who ran out of fuel in long fights. In the trees, back to back with a boy she barely trusted, she rationed. She stopped throwing the big castings after the first minute and started laying small, precise ones on the ground where the pack had to cross, funneling them into a gap Nox could hold with a sword. He told her which side they would come from, twice, before they came from it. She noticed. She stored it. They were winning. Then the deep pack thinned past the threshold and the clearing went quiet, and Nox's stomach dropped, because he knew exactly what that silence meant. The elite came from the left. He had died to that lunge 4 times before he learned it, and he was ready for it, and it did not matter, because his body was not the body that had learned it. He got the angle right. He got there half a second late. The impact took him off his feet and threw him into a tree hard enough that he heard something in his shoulder give, and when he tried to stand, the debuff from his own illness came down on him like a hand pressing on the back of his neck. His vision narrowed. His arms would not lift the sword properly. The panel in the corner of his eye was screaming at him in numbers he did not have the focus to read. The elite came in for the finish, and there was no version of the next 2 seconds where he survived it. What happened instead was a wall of fire directly across its path, thrown by a 15-year-old girl who had already burned through everything she should have had left, and who kept it up long past the point where her hands started shaking. She bought him 11 seconds. She screamed at him to get up while she did it. He got up, he used Genius Hour, and he knew exactly what it was costing him while he did it, and he spent the weeks anyway. 5 minutes was far more than he needed. The debuff from the gold scroll sat on the wolf like a weight, and the thing that had killed him 11 times in another life went down in under a minute, with a sword through the base of its skull, and Nox stayed standing over it for exactly as long as it took the ability to run out. Then he folded up in the leaves. Talia dragged him. That was not a figure of speech. She got him under the arms, and she dragged a boy taller than her out of the deep clearing while her own legs were failing, and she was still swearing at him the entire way, and Carl found them at the tree line and stood there patiently until she worked out that she was supposed to load him onto the horse. The ring was on the elite's corpse. Nox went back for it 2 days later, alone, and did not explain to anyone why a plain iron band was worth a second trip into that forest. He put it on and killed 3 ordinary wolves at the tree line to test it, and watched the number at the bottom of his sheet move upward for the first time since he had arrived in this world. Not much. A day, perhaps 2, for 3 wolves. Against something like the elite, it would have been weeks. He stood in the cold with his hands shaking and did the arithmetic that would define the next stretch of his life. The ring did not cure anything. It converted violence into time. Every dangerous thing he killed extended him, and the more dangerous the thing, the more it gave, which meant the only path to a long life ran directly through everything in this world that could end a short one. The system had told him to enter the academy. The ring told him why he would need to survive it. Back at the house, Talia did not speak to him for 3 days, and then cornered him in a corridor and asked him flatly what he had used in that clearing. He gave her the villain answer, something dismissive about noble secrets. She looked at him for a long moment and said that she had watched him choose to burn something to save both of them, and that whatever it had been, it had hurt him, and she was not going to pretend she had not seen it. Emma, waiting at the end of the corridor, watched her mistress walk away from a conversation with her chin up and her ears red, and understood with real alarm that this was going to become a problem for everyone. Theodore heard about the forest from the household guard, who had found tracks. He heard about the elite from a hunter who found the corpse. He said nothing to Nox at all. Instead, he assigned him a second maid. Her name was Loila, and she arrived with excellent references, perfect manners, and a level of competence that made Lona look like a child playing at housework. She could read 4 languages. She kept accounts in her head. She anticipated needs before they were spoken, and within a week she had reorganized his rooms so efficiently that he could not find anything. She was also, obviously, reporting to his father. Nox knew it before she opened her mouth, because he knew her. Loila appeared in Inner Lunatic as a support character with an unusually deep profile for someone who died in a throwaway scene about 2/3 of the way through the first act. Players who dug into her background found a tragedy the main story never bothered to show. Her parents had held a minor title. Her uncle had wanted it. He had taken it, and the parents had not survived the taking, and a girl with no name left had been placed into service in a great house where competence was the only currency she had. In the original route, she was sent on an errand at the wrong time and did not come back, and the story did not stop for her. Nox watched her set out his breakfast with mechanical precision and thought about how much simpler his life would be if he treated her the way the previous Nox would have. He asked her, on the 4th day, what his father had told her to look for. She did not blink. She said her lord's instructions were her lord's business, which was, in its way, a confession and a warning at the same time, and it was delivered while she poured his tea without spilling a drop. He decided he liked her, which was inconvenient. The ring changed how he thought about every hour of the day. Before it, training had been the only lever he had, and training was slow and expensive and paid him back in fractions. After it, the fastest route to more life ran through anything with a heartbeat that could be persuaded to stop having one. He started taking Carl out past the estate boundary 3 and 4 times a week, hunting the low-tier monsters that infested the border woodlands, and he kept a running tally in his head like a man watching a bank balance. The returns were disappointing. A boar-class beast gave him hours. A pack of them gave him most of a day. He killed 11 things in one afternoon, came home unable to lift his arms, and calculated that he had bought himself roughly 4 days of life at the cost of 2 weeks of physical wear. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Ordinary monsters would never outrun his clock. He needed dangerous things, and dangerous things killed people like him. Lona insisted on coming along after the 3rd trip, on the grounds that somebody had to carry the water, and somebody had to be there when he collapsed, which she said without a trace of humor. Loila came because Theodore had told her to come. The 3 of them made an absurd hunting party, 1 dying noble, 1 clumsy maid who talked to the horse, and 1 perfectly composed young woman with a notebook who was writing reports about all of it. He should have left Loila at the house. He knew what was coming. He had known since the day she walked in. In the original route, the thing that killed her was an elite that wandered outside its range during a border sweep. It was not a boss. It did not have a name. It was simply a monster in the wrong place on the wrong afternoon, and the story used it to end a character it had never intended to keep. Knox knew the season. He did not know the day, so he brought her with him, every time, where he could see her. She was better in the field than she had any right to be. She spotted tracks Lona walked over. She held the horses. She had a habit of positioning herself with her back to a rock face without appearing to think about it, and when he asked her about it, she said something bland about a childhood in the countryside, and her eyes did not move at all while she said it. She started asking questions around the 5th trip, careful ones. Why a lord with a household of guards hunted with 2 maids? Why he never took the same route twice? Why he counted things under his breath? He gave her nothing. She kept writing. What she could not put in a report was the thing she had started noticing, which was that her master was not cruel. She had been briefed thoroughly on Knox von Reinhofer before her assignment. She had arrived expecting a spoiled invalid with a temper. Instead, she had a man who did not raise his voice, who told a maid to sit down and eat before he did, who spoke to a horse like a colleague, and who wore an expression during quiet moments that she recognized, because she had worn it herself, in a house that had stopped being hers. She wrote none of that down. She did not have a word for it that would survive contact with Theodore. The elite came on a gray afternoon in the 7th week, at the bottom of a wooded slope, and it came from behind them. Knox felt it before he saw it. Mana detection at genius rating meant he did not need eyes, and what he read on that slope was wrong by a full tier. He had time to shout one word. The thing came through the brush at a speed that made the trees look stationary. It went for the nearest target, which was Lona, and Knox got between them the way he always did, and that was the mistake, because it was not going for Lona. It had gone wide to draw him, the way that class of monster does, and it came back in from his blind side while his weight was committed forward. Loyola was already moving. She hit him in the ribs with her shoulder and put him on the ground, and the strike that had been aimed at the back of his neck opened her from the shoulder to the hip instead. He got up. He does not remember getting up. He used Genius Hour without a second of deliberation, without the arithmetic, without the rule he had written for himself in his own room, and the fight lasted 11 seconds, and he took the thing apart in a way that made Lona turn around and be sick afterward. The ring gave him 9 days. Loyola was going to lose considerably more than that. The clause on that class carried a necrotic agent. He knew the item entry. He knew that the standard treatment stopped the spread and left the limb useless. And he knew that there was one preparation in the Empire that reversed it cleanly. And he knew the price of it, because in the game it was a joke item that players sold immediately. It cost more than the horse he had refused. It cost more than most manors. It was, specifically, the sort of expense a third son could not authorize without the household ledger recording it in letters large enough for his father to read from across the room. He wrote the order in the road, sitting in the dirt with her head in his lap and Lona pressing both hands on the wound, and shaking, and he sent the fastest rider on the estate with his family seal on the letter. Then he told the physician to keep her alive for 4 hours. She lasted 5. The preparation arrived in a lacquered box with 2 armed men escorting it, and the household steward brought it into the room personally so that he could witness what it was being used on. And when the steward hesitated in the doorway, Knox took the box out of his hands. She did not lose the arm. She was in bed for 3 weeks. Theodore came to the house physician's wing on the 2nd day, looked at the ledger entry, looked at the girl, and then looked at his son for a long time. He asked one question. He asked whether Knox understood what he had spent. Knox said he understood exactly what he had spent, and that he had considered it and spent it anyway, and did not explain further. Theodore left without another word, and that night he sat with a glass of wine he did not drink, revising his theory for the 4th time. Whatever had taken up residence in his son's body, it did not behave like anything he had read about. Possessing spirits did not empty a family account to save a servant. They did not sit at bedsides. He had been preparing, quietly, for the possibility that he would have to kill the thing wearing his son's face. He put that preparation away. He did not throw it out. Loyola woke on the 3rd day and began, immediately, to try to leave. She got as far as the edge of the bed. Lona put her back into it with a strength that surprised both of them. She tried again on the 5th day, and on the 8th she managed to get dressed and pack a bag before Knox found her in the corridor. Her argument was rehearsed. It came out flat and fast, the way people speak when they have said something to themselves 100 times in the dark. She had been sent to observe him, and she had failed to observe anything useful. She had cost him a sum that could have equipped a company of soldiers. She was, by any accounting she could perform, a loss on his ledger, and she had spent her whole life understanding precisely what happens to things that become losses on other people's ledgers. Her uncle had taught her that with his own hands. She would go somewhere else and be useful to someone who had not yet paid for her. She said all of it without crying, which was somehow worse. Knox told her she was welcome to leave, and that she would be doing it on foot, without references, into a country where a girl with her family name would be found by the man who took it inside a month. Then he told her that he had not bought a maid. He said he had spent that money on a person who had put herself between him and something that was going to kill him, and that if she wanted to call that a transaction she could, but transactions were things people were free to walk away from, and she was free to walk, and he would prefer that she did not. She stood in the corridor with a bag in her hand for a long time. Then she asked him, quietly, why he had brought her hunting every single time when he clearly had not needed her. He gave her the villain answer. She went back to her room. In the morning she was pouring his tea again, and her hand was steady, and she never mentioned leaving again. Her reports to Theodore continued. They also became, from that month onward, extremely carefully worded, and Theodore noticed that too, and said nothing about it to anybody. The academy term was still 5 months away. Theodore filled 2 of those months by sending his youngest son somewhere his youngest son had not planned to go. Chaders was a Rheinhafer territory in the southwest, a stretch of hill country with 3 mining villages, a monster problem, and a reputation for swallowing administrators. Grin was being sent to resolve it. Theodore instructed Knox to accompany his brother and observe, and the instruction was phrased in a way that made it clear observation was not really the point. Grin was delighted, or performed delight, which with Grin was functionally identical. He was 23, handsome in the way that gets written into marriage contracts, and he had a manner so pleasant that people frequently walked away from conversations with him without noticing what they had agreed to. In the game he had been a background name for most of the story, and then he had not been, and Knox had never entirely worked out which of the later moves in the family had been his. He watched Grin the way you watch a snake that has not yet decided anything. The column took 11 days to reach Chaders, and Knox spent them being useless in public and reading in private. Grin's soldiers had a low opinion of him by the 3rd day, which was the plan. Sick noble boy, sent along by his father to get some air. One of the sergeants started calling him the young master in a tone that did not require further comment. On the 14th day, in the hills above the 2nd village, Knox told the sergeant that the sweep team should not take the eastern ravine. The sergeant asked why. Knox said the ravine narrowed and the things nesting in it hunted in a spiral, and that anything entering with a full unit would be surrounded before it reached the halfway point. The sergeant took the eastern ravine. He lost 4 men, and came out with a broken collarbone, and he came back into camp and found the young master sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, and there was a silence in that camp for about 6 seconds that changed everything about the next 6 weeks. After that they asked him. Not officially. A soldier would drift past his tent and mention a valley, and Knox would say something about the water table and what fed near it, and the soldier would walk away, and the route would quietly change. Casualties on the sweep went to almost nothing. Grin noticed within a week, because Grin noticed everything, and did not raise it once, which was itself informative. Knox was not being generous. Every sweep he redirected was a sweep he could steer toward the things he actually wanted to kill. He hunted like a man planning a campaign. He took the elite classes personally, with the debuff scroll and the sword and genius hour held back as a last resort, and the ring drank from every one of them. 6 weeks in, Chaders bought him more time than 4 months at home had. He could feel the difference in his body before the panel confirmed it. He stopped needing to stop halfway up a staircase. In the 3rd village he went looking for a woman named Alina. She ran a potion shop out of the front room of a house with a bad roof, and she was, in Inner Lunatic, one of the most valuable recruitable characters in the entire first half of the game, and almost nobody ever found her, because she appeared for a single window in a village most players never visited. Her formulations were 40 years ahead of the imperial standard. She had left the capital after a dispute nobody would explain. He walked into her shop, looked at the shelves, and told her that her stabilizing agent was 3 degrees too warm during the second reduction, and that it was why her yield collapsed on the larger batches. She threw him out. He came back the next day, and she let him stay for an hour, mostly to argue. By the end of that week, she was showing him work she had not shown anyone in 6 years, and by the end of the month, she had agreed to relocate to Reinhardt land under his patronage, on terms that were, frankly, robbery. And she signed them anyway because he had made her one promise no other noble had ever made her, which was that nobody would tell her what to research. He did not tell her the other reason. He had a condition nobody in this world had a cure for, and he had just hired the best chemist of her generation. The corruption surfaced in the 7th week. The territory's tax receipts did not match its output, and the shortfall had been running for years, and the local administrator had built a very comfortable arrangement with a merchant house that involved underreporting the mines and moving the difference through a village that did not appear on any Reinhardt map. When the sweeps started clearing the monster problem, the arrangement started coming apart, because the monster problem was what had kept auditors away. Grin found the ledgers. Knox found the village. He found it because he remembered it. It had been a fetch quest marker in the game, an unnamed dot with a merchant sprite standing on it, and it had taken him 3 days of writing to confirm that a dot on a map he had memorized in another world was standing in front of him with a stockade around it. The administrator's men were waiting for the audit party. They had planned an accident on a mountain road, and the plan had been sound, and it failed because a sick young noble had insisted on a route change and refused to explain himself. Knox killed 2 men in that ambush and did not enjoy it, and he learned something about himself in the aftermath that he did not examine closely for several years. He also, on the way back through the second village, gave away most of the coin he had brought with him. It was not a decision. There was a group of children living in the ruin of a collapsed mine office, orphaned by 3 years of a monster problem nobody had fixed, and he saw them, and he handed a purse to the woman who was feeding them, and told her that if she said where it came from, he would take it back. The soldiers with him were sworn to silence with a threat so theatrical it was almost funny. They told everyone. Of course they told everyone. Within a month, the story had reached the capital in 3 different versions, and in every one of them, the Reinhardt boy was a great deal more interesting than the ledger said. Theodore read the Chater's report twice. Then he did something that made the entire household stop and stare. He gave Knox the territory. Not the title, not yet. Administration, revenue, and the authority to appoint. A 3rd son with no reputation, given a producing territory outright, months before he was due to leave for the academy. He also asked him, privately, in the study with the door closed, whether he would consider standing for succession. Grin was in the corridor when the question was asked. Grin heard the answer through a door that was not as thick as his father believed. Knox said no. He said it immediately and without appearing to think about it. And he gave a reason that was almost true, which was that the family head's chair came with 100 obligations, and he did not have the health for it. The reason he did not give was simpler. A family head cannot disappear for 6 months. A family head cannot vanish into a dungeon that does not officially exist, or spend a fortune on a formulation that will be tested on himself, or make the choices he was going to have to make in the next 2 years. The chair was a cage with a good view. Theodore accepted it. He was disappointed in a way he did not show. He also, that night, wrote to 2 allied houses about his youngest son in terms he had never used about any of his children, and those letters traveled, and by midwinter, people in the capital who had never met Knox von Reinhofer had opinions about him. That was the price of everything he had done in Chater's, and he did not fully understand it yet. He had spent 9 months making himself impossible to ignore, in a world where being ignored had been his best protection. Talia wrote to him twice during those months. He answered once, badly. Loyola read both letters before he did, because she read all his correspondence, and she made a note in her private ledger that had nothing to do with Theodore's reports. Winter broke. The academy term opened, and on a cold morning in the courtyard, with Lona crying openly, and Loyola standing at attention with her hands folded and her jaw set, Knox mounted a horse that had no pulse and rode toward the place the system had told him to go on the first day of his second life. Eladan Academy took the Empire's best and, over 4 years, either sharpened them or broke them. In Inner Lunatic, it was where the main story began. Every character who mattered walked through that gate. Knox knew all of them. He knew the boy in the year above who would be a national hero in 6 years and a traitor in 9. He knew which instructor was reporting to the Imperial House. He knew the girl who had already killed someone and buried it, and the cheerful heir who would die in the labyrinth in the spring if the original route held. Talia was in the entrance hall. She saw him and crossed the room in a manner that Emma later described as undignified. Their team assignment was posted the following morning, and the two of them were on it together, and Knox stood in front of that board for a long moment with a feeling in his chest that he could not immediately name, because the team roster in front of him did not match the one he remembered from any of his 27 runs. The world had started moving without him. Then a boy with an ordinary face and an open, friendly smile stepped up beside him to read the board, said something pleasant about the weather, and introduced himself as Rick. Knox did not react, because he could not afford to react, and reacting was exactly what his body wanted to do. He knew that face. He had seen it in a scene late in the first act, in a stone room with rain coming through a broken roof, and the boy standing in front of him now had been standing over someone Knox had spent 40 hours of playtime learning to like. Rick had not looked cruel doing it. That was the detail that had stayed with him. He had looked apologetic. Rick's profile in the game was almost insultingly plain. Poor mana capacity, mediocre swordsmanship, a single notable passive, listed under negotiation, which most players read as a shopkeeper discount and ignored. He was, on paper, the least dangerous person in the entire academy. He was also the reason 2 noble houses would tear each other apart, and the reason a merchant guild would collapse, and the point of contact for something that did not have a human shape. Knox felt his pulse climb and knew it was showing in his face, and he did the only thing he could do, which was activate the acting skill he had picked up in his first month and had been treating as a joke. It smoothed him out. The pulse stayed high. The face went flat and bored and faintly irritated, which was the correct expression for a Reinharfer being spoken to by a commoner scholarship student, and he answered with something dismissive about the weather being weather. Rick smiled and did not leave. That was the pattern for the next month. Rick was helpful. Rick appeared at the edges of things, carrying something, offering something, asking a question that seemed harmless. He knew everyone's name by the second week. He remembered which instructors preferred which forms of address. He got a second year to lend him notes, and a kitchen worker to save him bread, and a lonely heir from a minor house to consider him a close friend. All inside 20 days, and he did none of it with anything a mage could detect. Knox tried 3 times to make him go away, using increasingly rude versions of the villain act, and Rick absorbed all 3 without any apparent damage and came back the next day. So Knox stopped trying and let him stay close. It was the harder choice, and he made it deliberately. He could have crushed Rick socially in a week. He could probably have arranged something worse. He did neither, because he did not know what Rick was connected to yet, and killing a man's contact teaches you nothing about the man. He needed to see who Rick spoke to, and when, and what he wanted. Loyola would have approved of the reasoning. Loyola was 200 miles away, running a territory in his name, and writing him letters that were superficially about grain. Rick, for his part, had noticed something too. He had noticed that the sick third son of the Reinharfer house had gone very slightly still when they first spoke, and that the stillness had lasted less than a second, and that nobody else in the hall had seen it. He filed it away. He was patient about that sort of thing. The endurance course exposed him in the 3rd week. Eladan tested new students physically before it tested them any other way, which was reasonable, because the Academy's main missions did not care how gifted anyone was if they could not walk out afterward. The instructors ran the first years into the ground for 6 days and wrote everything down. Knox had been braced for it. He still failed it. He was faster than every student on the field over short distances. His technique in the sparring assessment was clean enough that 2 instructors stopped what they were doing to watch. And on the 4th day, in the long run, he made it a little past the halfway marker before his body simply refused, and he went down on the track in front of 90 people and could not get up for 4 minutes. A boy from a rival house made a comment. Talia broke his nose in the corridor that evening and was assigned 2 weeks of kitchen duty for it, which she performed with the air of a woman who considered it money well spent. The instructor in charge of the assessment was called Paracelsus. He was a 4th year, seconded to 1st year training, and he had a decorated family, a genuinely impressive record, and an ego that had never been dented. He read the file. Explosive short performance, exceptional technique, total collapse under sustained load. Then he watched Knox von Reinhofer walk off the field at a perfectly measured pace with his chin up as if nothing had happened, and he came to the conclusion that any confident person comes to. He decided the collapse was theater. Everyone knew the Reinhofer boy had entered the academy by putting both his older brothers on the ground. Everyone knew about Chaders, and here he was, playing at being a sick invalid, presumably so that people would underestimate him in the ranking matches. Paracelsus had met 3 or 4 nobles who played that game, and he had never once respected it. He said as much, publicly, at the end of the 6th day. He suggested that if the third son of the Reinhofer house intended to hide behind an illness, he might at least commit to the performance and not sprint like a man with functioning lungs during the assessment. There was laughter. Not much, but enough. Knox stood there with his shirt soaked through and his hands not entirely steady, being accused of faking the one thing in his life that was completely true, and he found that he was not angry so much as tired. He said nothing at all. He nodded once, politely, and left. In his room that night he opened the panel and looked at the number that had a year on it when he arrived, and rather more than that now, and he made a small private note about a 4th year named Paracelsus, and about a ranking match at the end of the term, and about exactly how long a fight against that particular opponent would need to last. The academy filled in around him. He was placed on a fixed team, as all first years were, and the roster held Talia, a quiet swordsman from a border house who barely spoke, a lightning affinity girl with an unsettling amount of energy, and one more name Knox had never seen on a team in any run he had ever played. That last detail bothered him more than anything Paracelsus had said. His memory of the original route was already fraying at the edges, and the fraying had started before he did anything. He kept up the villain act. It got harder every week. He was rude to instructors and impeccably prepared for their classes. He announced that he had no intention of helping anyone, and then talked a panicking first year through a mana control exercise at midnight in an empty hall because she had been crying in a stairwell and he had tripped over her. He told her to forget it happened. She told her entire dormitory. The rumors about him became strange and contradictory, which suited him fine. Half the year thought he was dangerous. The other half thought he was dangerous and hiding something. Talia had stopped forming a theory and started forming a habit. She trained with him. She ate with him. She got in the way of anyone who tried to make an issue of his collapses, and she did it so reliably that Emma eventually sat her down and asked her, carefully, whether she understood what she was doing and where it was likely to end, given that Knox von Reinhofer was a dark house's 3rd son with a reputation and a year expectancy that everybody whispered about. Talia said she understood perfectly and asked Emma to mind her own business, and then did not sleep well for several nights. Winter deepened. The labyrinth beneath the academy opened for first-year practicals, and Knox went down into it knowing every corridor and every mechanic and every scripted encounter, and found that 2 of the encounters were not where they were supposed to be. He came back up with his team intact and a headache that had nothing to do with the exertion. That was the point at which he stopped saying to himself that he knew what would happen, and started saying that he knew what had been going to happen, and the difference between those 2 sentences was going to be the shape of the rest of his life. The first real mission came in the spring. It was not a training exercise. 2nd years and above took contract work from the academy's board, and by long tradition a promising first-year team could be attached to one if an instructor sponsored it, and someone sponsored theirs. Knox suspected his father. He never confirmed it. The brief was thin, the way the dangerous ones always were. A dimensional space had opened in a disused chapel 8 days east. Something was leaking out of it. Recover what was inside. Seal what was left. Report anything unusual. Knox read the location on the posting board and had to put a hand on the frame. He knew that chapel. It was not a first-year contract. It was a main story location, one of the earliest points in Inner Lunatic where the story stopped pretending to be about school and showed the player what the world actually contained. There was an essence stone in that chapel. There was also something sealed underneath it that had been there for 400 years, and it had a name, and the name belonged to a demon. In the original route, that mission happened later, and it happened to someone else, and the party that took it came back with 2 fewer people than it left with. He stood in front of that board for a long time. Then he signed the team's names because the thing that his entire second life was built on was that he had a map nobody else had, and a map is worth nothing if you refuse to walk on the ground it covers. The chapel had an essence stone. Essence stones were among the very few objects in that world that touched life force directly, and he had a number at the bottom of his sheet that a stone like that could move by more than months. Talia asked him, on the road, why he had volunteered them for something that had made two instructors argue in front of the students. He told her the truth for once, or a piece of it. He said there was something in that chapel he needed. She asked whether it was dangerous. He said yes. She rode beside him for another hour and then said that she was coming anyway, and that if he tried the thing he had done in the forest, the thing where he burned something out of himself to end a fight fast, she would find out what it cost him one way or another. Behind them, at the rear of the column, Rick rode with the supply party. He had volunteered as auxiliary staff for a first-year contract, and the requisition officer had thought it was charming initiative and had written his name down without looking up. The chapel sat in a valley where nothing had grown properly in a very long time. The doors were open. They had been open for 4 centuries. Knox went in first, with a resurrected horse waiting in the tree line behind him, and a girl he had once watched kill him standing at his shoulder, carrying a map of a future that had already started to lie to him. The essence stone was on the altar, exactly where 27 playthroughs said it would be. Something moved in the dark beneath the floor, and it was awake, and it was early.